the nation. Como é que é, pessoal? Como é que é? Vier a ser Tekken, não é? A vantagem deste jogo é que posso ver música e ver vídeos. Isso eu acho bué da cool. Vocês é que não percebem. Devia para bué de mais baixo, isso aqui era. Tipo assim. Yo! Community research? Wait, what? Sentinel? Complete Nexus. Epá, isto mete-me logo na ação, meu. Estou a ver que, independentemente do Future Funk Mix que eu ponha, esta música aparece sempre. Ou então estou a confundir e parecem-me todas iguais. Okay. O que seria mais plausível, ok? Ai. Supostamente está ali um. Este Bolt Castro é bom. Viste aquilo? Então estava aqui a ver uma guerra e o gajo foge, meu. É só pussies no ranked. Happiness? Welfare, let's go. Eu sou um socialista do caralho, meu, só para correr. Tem bog. Falar em bog. Por causa da beat, agora jogo. Como é que se chama aquilo? Babazinho.
Don't you know your loving drives me crazy? But I don't know the reason why. Sweet imaginary lover, you turn me on with so much ease. And what you do is undercover. You know you got me in deep freeze, so baby.
Que o cara quer ver um vídeo sobre videojogos. Um vídeo de videojogos. Inception vídeo. Mandaste com o caralho. Chega a fazer isto. Uh-oh. É de mim ou dei bog a isto? Não. Semi-bog. Foi em semi-bog.
I don't know if anyone else feels the same way, but there's this thing that happens when you play a lot of video games. You start to kind of see between the lines, and you can spot the patterns and the tropes in enemies and level design before they've even really happened. You can, for example, look at a suspiciously empty massive room and know for certain that a big boss guy is going to appear the moment you walk in. You can spot a cracked wall and know you're going to unlock an explosive power at some point, and you can divine the location of hidden treasure by looking behind waterfalls because you've seen this stuff a million times before. Video game worlds being designed around common tropes and iconography is great. Not only do they make the design process a hell of a lot easier, but this kind of shorthand can be a great way to ease players into a game and let them feel like they're in control and the master of their domain, which can be great fun. However, many games out there are designed to be the opposite. They're all about throwing you in at the deep end of a hostile world that you don't belong in and forcing you to fend for yourself. That's a difficult mindset to get into when, in the back of your head, you can't escape the feeling that this supposedly mysterious environment is actually composed of familiar pieces and was explicitly designed with you in mind. Look at two games that pride themselves on being weird and asking you to survive in a strange, twisted world. Journey to the Savage Planet and Control. Both games have weirdo, fantastical settings, but both lose their sheen very quickly because it's all too obvious that they're built on a foundation of comfortable, familiar tropes. Journey to the Savage Planet starts off strong with your first few major advancements being utilising your disgusting space rations as bait and lobbing seeds around to create cool effects, but this potential quickly gives way to some very standard Metroidvania fare once you rip away the wallpaper. These weird blobs? They're just grapple points. These exploding flowers? Zelda bombs. Even these strange, gross orange slimes quickly get mentally filed away into standard video game health upgrade before long. And despite the genuinely good story and fantastic setting of Control, the game's attempts to suck you into an experience all about Lovecraftian weirdness and alternate dimensions of pure chaos bleeding into reality, the game is about as standard of a third-person action game as you can get, with even your crazy magic transforming weapon that can turn into literally anything, only ever taking the form of the 4 standard video game guns: a pistol, an SMG, a rifle, and a shotgun. Okay, there is a 5th late game gun, but even then it's basically just grenades. Combine that with some boring enemy designs, and you get stuck in this weird limbo where the setting of the Bureau is fantastic and constantly surprising, but that weirdness is dragged down by some of the most bog-standard, generic gameplay out there. The issue here isn't that these games are bad, more so that the way you interact with them is at odds with the way they want you to feel. Games can be great fun when they take us completely out of our element and into unknown, strange environments where we feel like we don't belong. However, there's a conflict between feeling like a world is mysterious and indifferent to us and being able to spot the recognizable and comfortable design patterns that we use to make it, which reminds you that this supposedly dangerous world was actually made specifically for you to have fun in. So, the challenge for games that want to create hostile feeling worlds is that weirdness and unpredictability isn't very much fun on its own. Just boot up LSD Dream Simulator and you'll be bored within 5 minutes. Games need a foundation of fun gameplay, but equally, the more tried and tested design tricks they use, the more compromised the illusion of an indifferent world becomes. It's a tricky one, but I think I've managed to find out a solution, and that solution is
You found a
cats.
solution?
Let me explain. During my research, I played a trio of games that each have fascinating approaches to their world design, and they all happen to prominently feature cats, which is why I've ordered and structured the 3 different approaches like so. A world that's good at making the player feel out of place can be challenging, alien, or turbulent, with the games that are the best at creating this indifferent feeling doing all 3. I'm really stretching the cat thing, but I'm in too deep at this point. Let's begin with what I think is the easiest way to make a world feel indifferent, and that is to ramp up the challenge. See, many games make the mistake of telling you that their environments are unpredictable and dangerous, but fail to really convey that through gameplay, with the enemies and hazards you're told are threatening actually being very easy to deal with, or obliterate entirely. Resident Evil 8's Sexy Vampire Castle is a great example of this. You get an almost exhaustive display of just how lethal Lady Dimitrescu and her daughters are, but when it comes to face them in non-scripted gameplay, it quickly becomes apparent that they're restricted to a relatively small area of the castle, and it's very easy to use your existing video game knowledge against them by hiding in a shop or a puzzle room which you know they won't come into. This creates this weird situation where the artificiality of these supposedly terrifying enemies is apparent almost immediately, and so the rooms with just regular zombies in are weirdly scarier because they don't announce themselves beforehand and can actually drain your resources because you have to fight them rather than just being made to run away a lot. The reason why Lady D and her kids are made this way is to help the player and avoid frustration, which is great, but in order to maintain that feeling of indifference, the threat and mystery presented by the world needs to have a tangible mechanical weight to it, rather than just existing through implication that quickly falls apart under scrutiny. This is why I love the Xenoblade games, because they are committed to having worlds that push back and aren't afraid to resist your attempts to explore them. Look at Xenoblade 3 for example, which, no, I'm not going to spoil any story content of beyond the fact that it contains a cat. The entire Xenoblade series loves bucking the open world trend by filling their environments with enemies that are way higher level than you, that can and will just sort of own you if you're not paying attention. In this early game desert area, on top of dealing with some plot related peril, your helplessness is reinforced by these massive level 50 dinosaurs stomping across the terrain that can and will just kill you if you aren't careful with your AoE attacks. The same goes for the game's proclivity for springing encounters with elite enemies or even bosses on you without warning, many of which are much harder than the equivalent story baddies. This forces you to constantly remain on your toes and to assess every treasure chest and every battle for hidden reinforcements that could overwhelm you in an instant. Of course, Xenoblade's not the only series that has massive bastards designed to keep you in that fun sweet spot of not being able to completely master the world you're in. Many other enemies fill the same sort of role. Guardians in Breath of the Wild are borderline unkillable early on, serving as a soft gate for late game areas and constantly reinforcing the power that destroyed Hyrule and nearly killed you. World of Warcraft's Stitches, at least before Blizzard chickened out, was a massive high-level zombie who would patrol down Duskwood's main road, normally its safest area, and wreck low-level characters just to freak them out. And Leviathans in Subnautica are the biggest, meanest fish in the sea, requiring constant vigilance as their distant roars remind you that you are an intruder in Subnautica's ocean and that you are never truly safe. Ugh. On that note, it's not just enemies that can add to a feeling of unwelcomeness in a game's environment. Many games use resource management to communicate that you're out of place, whether it's food and drink meters, oxygen, or just a time limit.
Survival
making stasis
games?
itself dangerous massively ramps up the tension of being in a given area. A particular favourite example of this is Outer Wilds' time loop, which constantly pressures you with the knowledge that you only got a limited amount of time before the universe explodes and you die, making even visiting planets you've already explored incredibly high stakes. With that said though, it's important not to confuse a perception of challenge with actually overwhelming difficulty. Making a game too hard can rip you out of an experience by making it feel just as arbitrary and artificial as one that's too accommodating. In any number of lazy, jump-scare survival horror games, dying a bunch can actually create a feeling of security because death no longer matters to you, and allows you to experiment enough to start figuring out ways around the enemies. But in a game like Amnesia, where running away from bad guys is pretty easy, and dying from sanity loss is actually impossible, the game becomes much scarier because it keeps you feeling vulnerable and at the mercy of the spooky castle for much longer. This brings me neatly onto our second letter in my terrible acronym, and that is that some indifferent
Crash Bandicoot, the game?
environments work by being alien. And by that I don't just mean sci-fi, I mean that it can be detached from, or different to, the way that we perceive and move around in the real world. By changing a game's topography and the way we move around in it, games can drastically change how accommodating they feel. In games with conventional modern settings, like, say, Grand Theft Auto or Far Cry, it's easy to get into the groove of movement and navigation because you're playing as a human person in worlds your brain is already trained to get around in, both in-game and in real life. In something like Exo 1, on the other hand, which sees you playing as a weird, rolling, gliding spaceship in strange alien landscapes, simply understanding the way you relate to the environment takes a lot of work, and it can,
Is the game
in a weird
dead?
way, kind of put you on edge, even if there's nothing dangerous, because you don't have that safety net of existing understanding to contextualize your experience. This sort of conceptual security doesn't just come from real life. As helpful as these little climbing guides are in Tomb Raider or Mirror's Edge, for example, they subtly act as a mental, well, handhold that gives you peace of mind that you're going the right way and don't need to worry about falling off. But in games like Getting Over It and the in-development Lorne's Lure, the environments don't guide you and were designed not to facilitate your movement skills, but push them to their limits, allowing you to feel like you're struggling through the skin of your teeth rather than allowing the world to pull you along. Probably the biggest example of this I felt recently was in a game called Hyperbolica, which is a puzzle game with the gimmick that everything takes place in hyperbolic space. Now that's a complicated geometry thing that I'm not really equipped to explain, but it basically means that space is curved in such a way that parallel lines will always diverge from each other, and you can take 4 right-angled turns and not be facing the way you were originally. Yep, it's weird. And so, when you're faced with insane, mind-bending stuff like it taking exponentially longer to walk around a circle than across it, or horizons that aren't where you intuitively think they are, you've got to relearn the basics of spatial geometry as you play, making the game feel weirdly uncomfortable, even though it's actually lovely and helpful the entire time. This feeling is called the uncanny, and it's actually a big part of the best Lovecraftian stuff once you get past all the racism. Something that seems familiar, but operates in unknown ways, can actually be more disorienting than something you've never seen before.
Makes sense.
To its credit, this is something that Control, the game I mentioned earlier, does really well, with its municipal levels having this permeating sense of subtle wrongness that's absolutely great. Having to unlearn your assumptions and then relearn entirely new rules can keep you in that great off-balance frame of mind for much longer. But I think the best game at using the uncanny to create an alien environment is actually Stray, a game with a cat in that utilizes this change in perspective to make simple mechanics a joy to play with. See, most of the game takes place in rundown cityscapes and junk heaps that are easy to understand visually, but because you're playing as a cat, who moves and acts in very different ways to a person, you've got to think about these familiar spaces in new ways. You're in a world clearly designed for people, But in Stray, in order to progress, you need to think like a cat. This means looking for footholds or small crevices to jump in while avoiding ground level as much as you can, because doors and streets designed to be easy for people
Foi
to
tudo com
navigate
caralho.
are much use to you. And there are some great moments early on when your brain stalls for a second,
Nem sei o que é que estava a
wondering
fazer
where to go,
antes
before you
disto.
realise you can just squeeze through tiny gaps or clamber
Por que
up
isto não deu
bookshelves
outra
to progress.
série?
The feeling, or the feline, of learning how to move as a cat feels really awesome, because it gives the spaces you're in a bunch of additional depth that you probably overlooked at first, with you seeing stuff like pipes not as background decor, but whole new alternate paths. However, this feeling of figuring out a whole new world can't last forever, and eventually you will get your head around being a cat and begin to notice certain patterns forming, like how air conditioners are basically Stray's default platform. It's a small thing, but spotting this pattern that's basically the result of the game's limited budget does take away some of the magic of its world design. It's not the game's fault, Stray is very visually impressive for what it is. It's just that humans are really good at recognizing patterns, and once we've identified the cold mechanical rules that govern what appeared to be an alive and unpredictable world, it's hard to treat it as an unknown quantity anymore. So, is there something that can be done about this? Well, I'm glad you asked. The third and final thing I want to
But I
talk
didn't
about when
ask.
it comes to making mysterious worlds is a little word that I've awkwardly crowbarred into an acronym called turbulence. And to explain what I mean by that, I need to introduce you to our third and final cat, Slug Cat from Rainworld.
I didn't play
the way
that
the game
game.
works is that you play as this adorable creature called a slug cat, which, as you might imagine, is half snail, half dog, who gets lost in a post-apocalyptic sprawl, long since abandoned by sentient life,
Post-
and filled
post?
with dangerous predators, mysterious machines, and deadly, deadly rain. The most obvious way that Rainworld communicates that the environment was not built with you in mind is
Post-
through its
post.
incredibly deeply realized ecosystem of horrible monsters that mostly want to eat you. Every single creature, from the lowliest fly to the biggest, horriblest, whatever this is, has its own systemic AI, and the game continues to simulate them even when
Oops.
you're in a totally different part of the zone. What this means is that the game is completely unpredictable, and organic AI interactions are constantly happening all around you as you try to scurry your way through each area. Lizards will start fighting each other to see who gets to eat you, offering a chance to escape. These primitive tribal creatures wander around the map hunting stuff, and you can use them as cover, and every single creature in the game has feeding grounds, territory, and even nests. Your presence
That's actually
within them
really cool.
affecting the way they act towards you and other creatures.
I
You
want
might be able to
happiness.
map out the world and its fauna, stock up on stuff like lanterns, flashbangs, and even these cute little grappling hook worms, but you'll never be able to predict or control the way the game's myriad intelligences will interact, turning an already perilous journey across a big lake into Jesus Christ, what is that? Nope, no thank you. This element of unpredictability is key to the dangerous appeal of a whole bunch of different environments. For example, it's also why the maps of battle royales / extraction games can feel so wonderfully tense and constantly surprising. You can know the map, the enemies, and carefully prepare your tools for each engagement, but there's no accounting for how other real people will act, creating messy, often tumble engagements that can happen anywhere at
That
any
is true
time,
and cool.
leaving you constantly on guard and weighing up every risk against this
Sorry.
unknown factor. It must be said, though, that this kind of chaotic, knocking the player off balance, needn't come from characters specifically. Just like in the case of making the world more challenging, this feeling can also stem from the more fundamental design of a world and can manifest in a variety of ways. What matters is that the player is kept guessing to the point that they can never comfortably predict what's happening next. Something like Psychonauts generates a great sense of novelty and apprehension, because each world isn't just a new backdrop for the same mechanics, but usually comes with a whole bunch
Hey.
of rules and ways to think about
Boas
the
noites,
environment. Like this
Alex,
charging
tudo bem?
ball that rampages through the level, or the entire world being a mini-game, or you being massive, or you having to navigate everything on a bowling ball. Equally, the Half-Life games do a fantastic job of making the world seem bigger and more complex than it actually is, by implying that there's an entire world just outside the near corridor that is every level. Every time you run into a scientist having their own struggle to survive in Black Mesa, every time the Combine ambush you from an inaccessible part of the city that doesn't really exist, and every time Alex runs into a little mini background story like this
Tem delay.
overrun by antlions,
Tem delay
the
na
world feels
cabeça.
just that little bit bigger and a little bit less predictable, even if every Half-Life game is basically linear. It's not until you realise that 90% of first-person shooters only put enemies directly in front of you that you realise how offsetting getting ambushed from all angles can be. Equally, this sort of chaos can be played for laughs. Going into The Looker, which is the spoof of The Witness, you think you know exactly what to expect, but the game uses that foreknowledge to screw with you, catch you off guard with sudden format changes, and build up the
Estou a ver aqui uns
greatest
vídeos sobre
long-con
jogos,
ever
meu.
seen in a video game, which I won't spoil. Whether a game uses danger, disorientation, or general randomness to create a feeling of a hostile world, one thing is shared between them. All these tricks are really doing is obfuscating regular fun design in ways that feel threatening and threatenable, but don't really hurt the game all that much. Ultimately,
I'm sorry.
though, not feeling a big
Como é
enough
que vai
saga in
isto?
a different world can last forever. Not only
Good
are
question.
games finite,
Vou.
but they wouldn't be much fun if you couldn't master them at all, and you could never get the satisfaction
Bem.
of beating territory
Pera, mandei aquilo
robots,
para o Freighter.
escaping the
Freighter.
underground, or getting your own back on these horrible spiders. The most fun part of being on the back foot and struggling against a world that feels hostile
Boa
is
pergunta, meu
eventually
caro
turning the
comparsa.
tables
Como-
and taking the
E
initiative.
você? Como é
And
que
we
você
do
me
that
sei? Como é que
by
está?
learning the patterns and the rules that govern
Já
these
conseguiu
environments.
implementar o comunismo?
Metroidvania is basically entirely oriented around this arc.
Na sua
Starting you off
comunidade?
in an uncharted wilderness with no power and limited means for you to defend yourself, and ending with you having built up a complete mental map of the world, as well as the means to get around and fight baddies easily. So, really, I think solving this problem of games that are supposed to have unfriendly, indifferent worlds actually feeling artificial is a matter of making this transition as smooth as possible. The abrupt realization of seeing an NPC creature's inner workings, or getting the handle on some funky controls too soon, puts you and the game at odds
sono.
with each other. So the best games with hostile
Se calhar não devia ter
worlds
começado a fazer
use the
stream
techniques
agora.
I've mentioned to help control the speed at which we eventually master them. It feels weird to say, but as we play games and build up a subconscious knowledge of how they ought to work, it becomes more and more difficult to get into a frame of mind where a world actually feels
Não queres.
unpredictable, because we've got that much more experience to fall back on. So, in a lot of ways, while developers can use some of these tricks to obfuscate the fact that they just want us to have fun, equally, we need to seek out weirder and more adventurous games as we get more experience with the art form.
Oh,
rather
esqueci-me
than
de tirar os
expecting
resources
approachable,
ali.
mass-market titles to have the same effect forever. Minecraft survival mode might have been
Isto
scary
bué da
at first,
radap ficou
but once you
pior,
work out
meu.
how it functions,
Ei.
that feeling quickly fades. So, instead of complaining, we should either make the most of this new, empowering experience, or find a trickier, stranger, or more chaotic game to recreate that same feeling of hostility. I guess what I'm saying is to get out there and go and play something that's outside your comfort zone, because not only do some of the best feelings of surprise, discovery, and triumph come from games that are willing to bend what you thought the rules were, but there's no better way to broaden your understanding of games as an art form. And maybe, just maybe, through a lot of training, you'll be able to get to my level and understand the true majesty and game design brilliance of Stray's dedicated meow button. Oh yeah. Ooh, that's the stuff.
Já jogaste o Stray?
Hello there and welcome to the after the video bit. Thanks for sticking around and / or being too busy fighting a boss or something to change the video. In this section, I like to point you in the direction of some deserving internet people for you to check out, because let's be honest, if you've come this far, you've got lots of free time on your hands and could probably use something to do. First up, I'd like to introduce you to Buried Treasures, a review site by Rock Paper Shotgun alumnus John Walker, focusing on teeny tiny overlooked indie games that you've probably never heard of. I've picked up some great recommendations from this site, and John is of course a delight to
I know.
find in any
Como é que
format,
está o,
so if you're looking for some
a
great game
FNAC?
recommendations,
A
there is an
FNAC.
entire archive of them on the website.
E a vida?
Go check
E
it
as
out.
amigas?
Secondly, it's
Como
time
achei
for
com
the
amigas?
Patreon shoutouts, and I'm actually thinking of doing something a bit different and introducing a new tier that you can check out on the Patreon page linked down below. Once per video, I'm thinking I'm going to randomly select a shoutout given to me by my Patreons and read it out for you all here. As an example, here's one graciously provided to me by an existing patron, Dotwo, who gave me the idea. He wants me to tell you that this episode was brought to you in part by bees.
Ah, é?
Bees.
Viste-me a jogar?
Bees. Have you thanked your local apiarist recently? They made this possible, along with all fruit. Bees. It might not work, it might be dumb, and I might decide not to do it after all and just refund people, but it could be fun. Anyway, for the rest of the people already supporting me on Patreon, they get
Tens que lhe
early
mandar uma
access to videos,
mensagem.
their name in the credits, behind the scenes content, and even the occasional special exclusive update video from yours truly. And if that wasn't enough, they get the warm, happy feeling of actually supporting me in a way that YouTube's terrible ads don't. Meaning that if you are or ever were a patron, you get my eternal forgiveness for ad blocking my videos, because let's be honest, adverts suck. And if you donate $10 a month, you get a special
Oh meu Deus, vamos fazer donate a este gajo.
truly, like these fine people, who are Alge, Andrew Lebrano, Asaran, Alno94, Bjorn Kala, Brennan Spalding, Brian Notariani, Constantine Amend,
Aurora
Cosmic
Borealis.
360, Daniel Metjes, Das Kangaroo, David Setzer,
Então e a tua amiga, tá boa?
Donswo, Diggy Dog, Digleteer, Ecton, Edward Franklin Woods,
Não consigo, não consigo estar acordado.
Gretar Hannison,
Que horas são?
Jacob Dylan
10.
Riddle, Janos Fakete, Joey Bruno, Jordan Gear, Lee Berman, Lucas Slack, Mace Window 54, Max Filipov, Knox, NWDD, Nate Graff, Patrick Romberg, Peter D. Tomasak, Philby the Bilby, Phoenix Thurikaz, Rajigar, Reddit
Tá sempre boa?
Regal Rajex,
Ei.
Ray's Dad,
Isso é muito estranho, nunca ninguém está sempre bom. Quer dizer que ela não te conta as coisas.
Strateger in Ultima, The Forbidden Shrimp, Tin Markovic, Tyler Duncan, Whimsical Wisp,
Decline.
Zach Grendel, and Chow. Whew, that was a long one. Anyway, I will see you around. Stay
Hold
safe
on.
up there.
Está aqui um
Bye
filho da
bye.
puta. Vai deitar-te? Quer dizer, ainda agora cheguei e já me estás a mandar embora. Isto é de uma... É de uma má educação. Já percebi. Ela não diz, mas tu também não queres saber. Decline. Estou a ser má onda. Já parei. Epá.
The year is 1996. A young high schooler we'll call Darius is practicing American football. He goes to tackle another player, their helmets collide, sweat flies, and things go white for a moment. Darius is shaken up, disoriented, but the sensation passes as quickly as it comes. I'm fine, he tells himself.
Não acho aceitável ter que lhe perguntar essa frase, é muito bizarra.
That evening, he begins to notice that he cannot
fazer
see
muito rephrase
in
a
his
isso.
left eye. He treacherously veers, panics, stops, and calls his father. The next day at the doctor, he is assured his vision will return in 2 to 3 days.
Uma
It
pessoa
does
muito
not.
balançada.
Doctors run tests, MRIs find
Yeah,
nothing.
that sounds-
His primary care physician can find nothing wrong, and according to his ophthalmologist, it was impossible for Darius not to see in the bad eye. Another round of tests at another eye specialist out of town
Sounds
finds
weird,
nothing
bro.
abnormal.
Everybody's got
Even
problems.
His second opinion yields no
Anyway.
answers, and yet Darius has made
Next,
no improvements. This young man is now half blind, and doctors cannot ascertain why.
What the fuck is this video?
Okay, fair warning. Today, I am going to do something on this channel that I never do, which is talk about psychology that is based not so much in replicated empirical research, but in the ideas of a few psychologists in the early 20th century. Ideas
Oh,
that
yes,
have very little
the
if
psychology
any
that
current
everybody
day research
uses.
backing them. By talking about these ideas, I am not saying that they are true or false or even really taking a stance either way. I'll simply be presenting them because they are important for the subject matter at hand.
Do it,
Will
man.
be
Present
interesting?
it.
Wildly. Will
I
it be
wanna see it.
entertaining? I certainly hope so. Will it be something to better
Present
understand
these
yourself
nuts.
or be taken as advice? Well, that's entirely up to you. Use your own judgment. We will, of course, also be talking about a few actual scientific studies as well, including the one I opened up with, and we'll swing back to that was, in fact, a true story covered in
Man,
this
sabes o que é
research
que...
paper. Oh, and here are
Sabes o
your
que é que me
trigger
falta,
warnings,
meu?
and
Amanhã
there will
vais-
be minor
amanhã vais trabalhar?
complex spoilers for a few
Tenho que
shows
fazer uma
throughout.
stream em
I'll
que fique
tag them with
completamente
this
bêbado.
as they come up. But for the
E o
first
ideal era
time
matar-me
ever
no-
on
a meio da
Psychoplay,
stream.
We'll be talking about psychology from
Não
a
seria a meio, seria ao
historical
fim, né?
and cultural perspective. But then again, this isn't a psych of play.
Seria fucking
Is it?
epic. Jesus, bro. Por que este pessoal não aprende a fazer... Ai, meu Deus. Mas o pessoal não sabe fazer balance aos vídeos.
I have watched a lot of anime in my day. I have read a lot of manga. I have played my fair share of anime games. I am what you
Com
would call
propó-
a
não
closet
usual com
weeb
propósito.
because
Então,
I
mete
don't
uns comprimidos.
really talk about this much unless we are close friends and you also enjoy
Mete
this little
montes de
slice of
comprimidos
media.
na
I've never
vida.
really been able to put my finger on
Pois
it, but
adormeço.
anime and manga have always done a spectacular
onde é que
job
está?
of doing one of two things. Making me squee
Wait,
like a little
hold
girl
on.
when something aggressively wholesome happens,
I have to meet him,
and
bro.
giving me a chance to interact with something extremely heavy or uncomfortable in a way that no other medium really does. I'll give you an example. My wife and I recently finished the first season of a show called True Detective. It's one part buddy buddy
uma
cop
mulher?
show, one part twisted crime mystery drama, and about 5
Que
parts
flex,
character
meu.
exploration.
Palhaço.
Over the course of several years, our two main characters, detectives Cole and Hart, work together to hunt down a man who has been brutally murdering women while also dealing with their own off-the-clock anxieties. Hart's marriage and relationship with his daughters is in shambles as he turns to alcohol and women to
Shambles.
cope with the abhorrent sights he comes across as a detective, and conversely, Cole is obsessing over his investigative
Não,
work
vi
to
uma
distract
cena e fiquei
himself
tipo,
from
ei,
a past trauma. The
pretty
first
cool.
season, at
Depois não
least,
vi.
illustrates their struggles directly through their actions and dialogue, and
Oh
metaphorically
não, será que isto vai
through
dar
their
bug?
endeavor to hunt down this mysterious, putridly heinous killer. We understand what Cole has gone through because it has manifested itself in his
enganei-me.
repeated nihilistic mutterings.
I think human consciousness is a tragic misstep in evolution. Program.
Isto é giro, mas é suposto aprenderes com isto. Alguma coisa. E usar na vida.
Everybody's nobody.
That sounds god fucking
Não é só para
awful,
consumir.
And we understand what Hart is going through because we watch him repeatedly, strongly regret his decisions. And through the pursuit of a common enemy, we see them grow and overcome their demons, at least to some degree. This is how a lot of stories in the Western world are written. Internal struggles are manifested through actions and dialogue. Evil is represented by another character.
Evil.
And overcoming said evil is a metaphor for the good guys overcoming the darkness they have within themselves. However, in my experience, a ton of anime is written just a little bit differently. I realize this is a gaming channel, so to ease us into this, why don't I start with an anime game? Persona. Imagine for a moment
Persona?
that in True Detective, both men had to face their inner demons.
Because Persona,
directly,
cool.
not
Persona
in a physical
5.
sense through their decisions, but in a metaphysical sense by literally facing their darker selves. Imagine that the killer was not a person to arrest, but instead an aspect of a person to defeat. Imagine that the villain was not just a man serving as a metaphor, but instead a literal polymerization
metaphor
of
serving
Cole
as a
and Hart's
man.
anxieties and dark thoughts. This is how many manga, anime, and anime
Manga.
games like Persona illustrate evil. We don't just see real-world consequences of internal anxieties and fears, we see actual metaphysical manifestations of them that are to be dealt with directly. In Persona, the gang doesn't deal with this teacher's sexual harassment by catching him in the act, getting evidence, and reporting him. We go meet his subconscious self and physically beat it into submission until it will listen to reason and understand the error of its ways. In a really fantastic anime called Rascal Does Not Dream of Bunny Girl Senpai, yes, that is the real name of the show, we see a handful of characters who
Eu agora
aren't
não
just
vou conseguir
facing
ver,
anxieties in the way you or
Better
I
Call-
might. We
Better
see
Call
those
Saul.
anxieties come to life in physical symptoms. Mai Sakurajima is slowly realizing that people in the real world can no longer see her.
Man, this is a
Not
bug.
emotionally, as if she doesn't truly feel seen, but physically, she is fading from the awareness of the people around her. Even going so far as wearing this in a public library just to see if anyone will finally notice her. This is happening to her, as we find out, because she feels isolated due to her complicated relationship with her mother, work, and school life.
Bro.
Later in the show, her younger sister Nodoka's jealousy of Mai causes them to swap bodies until they can work through their issues.
Yeah, mas os fãs estragaram
In Jujutsu Kaisen, Yuta Okatsu is
minha
haunted by
vontade de
the
ver.
death of his childhood friend Rika, which again doesn't result in a nihilistic worldview and obsession with the cold case. It manifests
essa cena
in
dá
a
muita
wildly
vontade de ver.
powerful and jealous cursed spirit that represents the trauma of losing his
3
first
stars?
love. And we see this everywhere in anime and manga.
Anime.
Itagi Senjugahara's weightlessness in
Anime
Bakemonogatari
and
is
manga.
a symptom of repressed trauma that would
Se for de uns
otherwise
fãs.
weigh her down.
Eles só
If
têm
you've seen
shit
Naruto,
taste.
you'll know that the
Estragam tudo.
Sharingan Eye manifests
É por isso que
when
eu não
a
vou- eu ia
Uchiha
ver,
reaches
mas
a
agora já
certain
não
level
vou.
of hate and only grows more powerful as that hatred intensifies. And I can't tell you how many times in shows like Gurren
Eu até já
Lagann,
tinha
it
sacado
seemed
e
like they
tudo.
made these physical giant robots and drills grow
3
from
estrelas,
sheer
não vai
ambition
dar.
alone. Spiral power, cursed energy, ki. Japanese media seems to have a fascination
3
with
estrelas,
physical
calhar dá.
or metaphysical
Deixa eu ver.
manifestations of emotions. We don't just see emotion embody motivations and a dialogue, we
Com o
often see it
Yayate.
embody the real world itself as an actual hurdle to be overcome, a real tangible location, an enemy, a weapon, an appearance, a symptom. It's almost like a surreal, fantastical version of what our friend Darius is going through. You see, what I didn't tell you is that Darius is suffering not just from blindness, but also an immense amount of pressure from his father. Our boy is a 6'5", 290-pound dog, and he's still only in high school.
This is an exploration
his
one?
community, and especially his father, are all expecting great things
His
out of
father.
him. Being in his shoes means going to a big Division I college on scholarship and could mean stardom one day in the NFL. And because of this pressure, Darius is experiencing an uncharted level of stress that is manifesting in a wildly unconventional way. Blindness. This is an extremely rare condition called conversion disorder, when an anxiety, an emotional trauma, a fear manifests symptoms that cannot otherwise be explained medically. And it's not just blindness. Another study highlights a young boy that is losing mobility in his arm and experiences constant pain throughout as a response to his father's unemployment and his mother's scary cancer. There is another case of a woman dealing with speech impairment and tremors in response to memories of sexual abuse. If you remember the Girls of Leroy in the old Lavender Town video we did, same business. Physical symptoms for mental wounds. Many would call it faking, but these symptoms are experienced as very real to those afflicted. You see, conversion disorder is one of the body's ways of intervening when a stressor becomes far too much. Darius felt like he couldn't quit football because of his dad, but after the psychiatrist in this study stepped in and made it clear to Darius' father that this might be the issue, Darius and his father talked it out. It was made clear that he could drop football if he really wanted to, and that his father would love him all the same. Once they had this talk, the eyesight returned.
I wanted to locate
days.
pirates.
Senju Gahara's weightlessness can be interpreted as a safety mechanism to keep her from carrying the heavy burden of her home life falling apart after her mother's abuse.
Really?
It's only after she accepts the burden as her own that her weight returns and she can
Somatizar sintomas de stress e nervosismo.
Relations between Mai and Nadoko were strained by a mutual jealousy. Those feelings took form in a body swap to give each other a chance to literally walk in each other's shoes.
Como é que se chama?
It's only by
Roiridoso.
understanding and accepting each other and themselves that they can return to normal. And I think this is one of the many things that fascinates me about anime, the surreal nature with which internal struggles are illustrated. It's artfully placed in the open as a player rather than just a motivator.
Mas não consegues fazer coisas? Tipo, imagina, jogar. Não consegues jogar porque eles não tremem ou assim?
Why do people play games the way they do? Why does this game make people feel this way? And so here, I was asking, why so much conversion disorder? Was there some mass psychogenic event in Japan at some point? Where is this coming from? What is the connection between this illness and this trope? And the answers I found were, well, they weren't that simple, because this trope isn't that simple. I'd like to make a proclamation. I really like Chainsaw Man. It's an absolute roller coaster of a manga. The anime is going to be a banger. I like Makima. I like Power more. I like Denji best. I feel sorry for Kabini, and sometimes I wish I could teleport her to that planet in Teen Titans where the little aliens give you massages and feed you grapes. And one thing that I find interesting about Chainsaw Man is that the characters known as devils in it all derive their power from public perception. The more the general public fears said devil, the more ferocious it becomes. For example, sharks are scary, right? I think most people would agree. Here is the shark devil. He's pretty strong. Bats? Yep, same thing. Here is your bat devil. Anyone afraid of chickens?
Yes, it's safe here.
Yeah, not many. So here is your chicken devil. Guns? Yes. Especially nowadays, especially after certain events have taken place. And Chainsaw Man does not stray away from this. The public's collective anxieties manifest here much in the same way that they do on an individual basis in our little slice of life anime.
It's crazy.
And as I was reading Chainsaw Man back in August of last year, it really resonated with me, but it also occurred to me that I think I've
Alguma vez
seen this
pensaste em
before.
como
Jujutsu Kaisen, another show that I
já
really
pensaste em
quite
como,
like,
sei lá, resolver?
actually
Género,
quantifies and makes
perguntar
a
ao psicólogo
currency
assim.
out of negative human emotion, cursed energy. All humans have it, and as it leaks out in times of strife, if enough is built up, a cursed spirit is born. Populated locations like hospitals, parks, and schools are typically breeding grounds for these baddies because
Não
of
podes
all the
perguntar ao
dark
psiquiatra,
emotions
senão
associated with
diz-te
them.
logo para tomar qualquer
And in
merda
certain cases,
para
like our
esquecer
boy
que
Judas
existes.
from earlier, it only takes one heavy trauma to create an extremely powerful
Mete logo drogas
curse.
pela
And
veia adentro.
historically, I think a lot of this general public anxiety feeding into the power of the bad guys trope comes from the old Shintoism belief in yokai, mischievous spirits that inhabit the
Yokai?
world around us. In the show Natsume's Book of Friends, a yokai's power is determined by the number of people that believe in them, which I think is an interesting parallel to this idea because some sources say that one origin of yokai is that they were
Really interesting?
superstitious explanations
Think it's really
of
interesting.
misfortune in Japan. Take for instance the Kappa yokai.
Do
They
you need a
spend
drug? I
time
need
in
the
lakes
drug?
and marshes,
Fuck, tudo menos
love
isso,
to
meu.
wrestle with children, and will, occasionally drag a child downstream with them. They're superstitions
Wow,
and
cryo
folktales that only gain steam the more credence they are given. They are
Olha, não é
only
verdade, mas
as
estou a ficar
real
ultra
as
mega
the public
ultimate
makes them.
rico.
The more these things are talked about, the more they take form in the
Oozing
collective
moss.
unconscious. And this is where things get unsettling.
Oh no, it's unsettling. I don't care, dude. Fuck you. Anyway.
Nah, I'm just kidding. We aren't talking about Ava. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist. He studied under Freud.
Don't
to
talk
take that
about
for what it's worth,
psychiatrists.
Until he eventually went his separate ways from Freud because he disagreed with a lot of Freud's ideas. Take that for what it's worth. Mainly, he thought that Freud's conceptualization of the
sou
unconscious
rico.
was too
Spooky
limited
time.
and overly
It
negative.
is true.
He
Por
also
acaso borrei-me
disagreed
todo.
that sexuality was a key motivating behavioral force, meaning Jung clearly never watched interspecies reviewers. He laid the foundation for the study of introversion and
sagonado.
extroversion, and there is a crowd of psychiatrists still working today that consider themselves Jungian in their practice. Like I said at the beginning, I'm not here to take sides, use your own judgment, but most of his ideas, barring intro and extroversion, have very little backing from
Desert
current day
environment,
empirical research.
rotting planet,
One such idea is his concept
radioactive
of the collective
planet.
unconscious, that lying in the depths of each and every one of our psyches is a genetically passed set of ideas
Boiling
that we share
planet.
with every other human on the planet. Have you ever watched a movie and felt like you could place each character into a stereotypical category? The shady guy with ulterior motives, the wise, mother-like figure, the innocently naive hero who is inevitably betrayed or taken advantage of. According to Jung, these are archetypes that we all inherently understand from birth, and we recognize these traits in ourselves and each other because we come with a built-in blueprint of each. There
We
are
do?
4 main archetypes that you may recognize,
Persona,
12
shadow, anima,
sub-archetypes,
self.
and Jung admittedly proposed that deeper than that, there may be no limit to the number that exists. You might be afraid of the dark or clowns because they are archetypes passed down through previous generations. In a nutshell, your unconscious mind is the collective culmination of ancient wisdom that came before it. And
Bro.
you better believe that this has influenced a ton of media. You could argue that the
Do you believe
objects
this
of power and
bullshit?
control gain said power because they are archetypes developed from being symbolic of something in the public eye for years. A ringing telephone, a rubber duck, a horse from a merry-go-round. Ordinary things that come alive due to repeated perception and associations. Katsura Hashino, the director of the Persona series, said in an interview with Killscreen that Persona addresses problems people hold deep in their hearts, and that his games are meditations on the true self, which you may have noticed from a moment ago, the persona is one of the 4 main archetypes proposed by
Oh
Jung.
my
To
God.
Jung, the persona represents all of the different
It all
social
comes together.
masks that we wear.
This
in
guy's a
everyday
genius.
life. It's there to help us behave in a way that society expects, to follow social norms, and to mask all of the primitive urges, impulses, and emotions that aren't socially acceptable. Persona the games seem to directly comment on this by having characters again often face their own shadows and the shadows of others that, much like Jung's archetype of the shadow, are completely instinctual. The shadow is the unfiltered desire in the unconscious that is composed
Oh
of
my
repressed
god,
ideas,
I wanna touch
weaknesses,
boobies
and
with my
instincts.
shadow.
The Persona series is actually extremely Jungian, and one of the most interesting places in the game for the purposes of this video is Mementos in Persona 5, which sort of illustrates the pop culture version of Jung's collective unconscious. It is literally a living, breathing,
Literally.
connected network of the general public's cognition.
Literally.
When it rains, moods drop, so monsters become stronger.
Partilhas?
When it's flu season, enemies often start the battle with despair. If it's a heat wave, they might start the battle burned. And this illustration of the collective
Ganda
unconscious, while a bit
Fala mais
unfaithful
sobre
to
isso.
the source material, I think also really
Elabora.
embodies the collectivist
Tipo,
nature of the general public in Japan
como é que eu ia dizer?
compared to the individualistic nature of the West. And you can obviously see the
Como é que eu te
parallels to this
pergunto
in
isto?
Chainsaw Man and Jujutsu Kaisen. The
Como é que tu
public's
dás
collective
map
fears are a
das
huge
ideias do
player in
Jung
both series.
para
Hell, even
a
in
vida à
the
tua
region called
volta?
Dan, the collective unconscious is mentioned by name when explaining why these guys.
I wanna go
attacked
to
the
the
game.
to a
By the way,
paradise
you need
planet.
to be reading Dan. It is genuinely fantastic.
Oh my god.
Mark my words, this will get an anime adaptation one day and take the world by storm. If you thought Marin and Lady
Man,
Dimitrescu
fala
were
com
bad,
Wish.
just wait until the internet catches wind of Ayase's grandma. Anyways, we've well established that the collective
Epá, está tudo
unconscious,
a bugar,
regardless of
meu.
how accurately it is portrayed, is a huge influence on a lot of Japanese media. But at this point, during my research of this video, I still couldn't find a connection. Why was Jungian psychology so big in Japan? Well, honestly, it kind of wasn't. At least not any bigger than it was anywhere else in the world. So, what's going on? What am I missing?
Teoria social.
Why was
Não, mas e a
Jung
tua vida?
such
A tua
big
vida? A
influence on
tua
the
vida.
East?
Vou contra uma pedra.
I had it backwards. It wasn't Jung that had an influence on the East, it was the East that had an influence on Jung. As fate would have it, a few years after Jung broke up with Freud, his interests turned east and he actually drew a ton of inspiration from Eastern culture and religion. According to this 2019 article from the Pacifica Graduate Institute, Jung's investigation of Eastern culture
Que
and
cá estou a vender
religion
esses cryopumps.
supplied him with an abundance of cross-cultural materials
Mas não
to
já.
compare with his hypotheses of archetypes, the collective unconscious, and other manifestations of psychic reality. In other words, it's entirely possible that a lot of aspects of Jung's collective unconscious were influenced by the collectivist culture of the East as well as religions like Buddhism. What we've been talking about this
Pump it up.
entire time
Don't
may
you
not just
know?
be a Jungian
Ok, há uma série de
influence,
coisas que fazem
but also
sentido. Apesar de reconhecer que há
Buddhist.
pouco sou quase
When
nenhum
Senju
dados
Gohara
empíricos
is
que
being
surgem
questioned before she
suportem a
faces the
psicologia
source of her
junguiana.
weightlessness,
Na
she
minha
was asked
cabeça,
who her favorite novelist is, and she reports,
na minha cabeça,
"You
não
know,
parece.
who was in fact an author and Buddhist monk in the early
com
20th
licença.
century, best known for his surrealistic narratives.
Não sei se é a
not
cena
unlike
que
the
melhor
ones we
explica
talked about
as
today.
pessoas.
One arc in
No
Jujutsu
entanto,
Kaisen's first season features
esta é
cursed
precisamente
objects
a
known
razão
as
pela
the
qual eu te
cursed
perguntei a ti
death
como é que tu dás
paintings. These
map
are
a
nine
isso, a
suits
vida.
created with mixed genetic material of both a cursed
Porque assim começa a
spirit
fazer-me
and a
sentido.
human. These give rise to new
Sou uma pessoa que
villains,
não
and
acredita
one
em
of the
puro
most
testamento como
badass fight
verificação de
scenes I've
tudo.
laid my eyes upon in a long time, but the name Death Paintings is actually a reference to the Buddhist art of Kusozu.
Não sei o que é quer dizer como puro
Series of
testamento.
9 paintings portraying the 9 stages a decaying corpse goes through before it eventually turns to dust. They are, as you can imagine, repulsive.
Fala
and the
português,
point
pá.
was apparently to be a resource for monks.
Olha,
If a monk
este
felt
asteroide
he
não
was
está
being
mesmo aqui,
tempted
meu.
by bodily desires, he could view the art and remember the temporary nature
Bro.
of the flesh. Really cheery stuff. And in an interview between Gege Akutami, the creator of Jujutsu
Oh,
Kaisen,
Akutami
and
G'day
Kubo, the
Baduba.
creator of Bleach, these death paintings came
Baba
up.
de boobity.
Kubo noticed them and pointed out that he too likes to incorporate Buddhism in his
It's the
writing.
babidi boobity,
These
man.
rings that appear when Tosin uses his Bankai actually have the names of the 9 stages of death paintings written on them. Both admitted to finding inspiration in Buddhism and even agreed that it is essentially Japanese
Buddhism is
mythology,
cool.
which I think is really the root of this whole collective unconscious idea we've been trying to get at this entire time. There is a concept in Buddhism known as non-self. To wildly oversimplify it, by extinguishing one's selfish desires and replacing them with an undying loving kindness, you can find true happiness. that by practicing compassion instead of pride, you can empty yourself out, achieve the non-self state, and understand the fundamental meaning of being alive. And this non-self concept, as well as other Buddhist ideas, were a large influence in the
Claro,
work of
Sigma
one
Grind
Japanese
Set
psychologist
ao Aleph.
named
6 da manhã,
Kawai, who actually
acordar e ir ao
introduced the
ginásio,
ideas to
batido
Japan
de ovo,
in
estrelado.
1955. Young and Kawai both agreed that the major difference between the Western and Eastern conceptualizations of the self was where the self lies within our own consciousness. What I mean is that the Western self is very contained in the conscious mind. However, presumably because of the collectivist nature of the East as well as Buddhist influence, the Eastern self is not contained here. It leaks into the unconscious. According to Kawai, the self in Westerners is put in the center of consciousness, meaning that the self is thought of as strong, central, and independent. The Eastern self, however, lives in the unconsciousness, which means that the self is rather fluid. Jung echoed this. In 1954, he wrote, "To the West, consciousness is inconceivable without an ego. If there is no ego, there is nobody to be conscious of anything. The ego is therefore indispensable to the conscious process."
Spitting facts,
The
just
Eastern
Jung,
mind, however,
ganda
has
Jung.
no difficulty conceiving of a consciousness without an ego. Consciousness is deemed capable of transcending its ego condition. Indeed, in its higher forms, the ego disappears altogether. Wait, leaks, fluid, empty, disappear? It all... Why does it always come back to Ava? Obviously, a
Bro,
lot could be said of
este gajo não
Evangelion
consegue-
in this
não
context,
consegue.
right? Especially that scene. Oh, right, spoilers for the 20-year-old show everyone's obsessed with. You can see threads of Kawai's illustration of the Eastern model of consciousness here. You can interpret the orange liquid everyone gushes into as unconsciousness.
Oh, there's
You can
pyrite
interpret
here.
the AT fields, which by the way stand for absolute terror fields, I just learned, as the boundaries of the ego, keeping the self separate from the unconscious and presumably the unconscious of others. Once it goes away, we all become one large nucleus of unconscious goop. But ultimately, Anno takes these Jungian Buddhist concepts, much like every other show we've talked about today, and brings a literal interpretation to them.
Literal.
To achieve the true meaning of life, the Human Instrumentality Project, not only does the idea of a self need to be abandoned to achieve happiness, but the physical self must be relinquished as well. Obviously, this particular ending of Ava is, well, a feverish nightmare, and we could spend hours picking apart what it all means and why I'm completely missing the point, but it's just another example that I think would be the most complete and the most striking of everything we've talked about today. You know, writing this script started with me trying to understand the origin of a trope I've seen in anime. Naturally, this being the show that it is, I went to psychology. I wanted answers, and I still can't decide if I really found them, but I think I did find something
Psychology
else along the
sucks
way.
if you want answers.
I think I understand why anime moves me the way that it does. I am
Because you're a
an
fucking
American
weeb.
for what it's worth, and whether or not me living here
That's
my
the
entire
reason.
life has caused this or not, I am a very prideful person. I'm
A very
competitive.
disgusting
I'm
weeb.
insecure. I like to show off. I think a lot of myself, and admittedly, I'm not as empathetic or as good to other people as I wish I was.
Aw.
I am very individualistic.
Me
My
neither.
EQ field is strong as hell.
I'm
dog.
also not
I guess-
empathetic.
I guess
Fuck
anime
people.
takes these subtleties of a lot of American media and makes them not so subtle. That burning feeling
Not so
I get when
subtle?
I see injustice in the world, that's not just a feeling in anime, that's a transformation. Those sorrows I have about the people I've lost in my life, that's more than just a feeling in my
Kamehameha.
gut. In anime, it's something
Olha, tu não
tangible,
jogas
something I
Fortnite?
can
Tá lá o Son Goku
perceive, at
agora.
least to
Grande
some
cena,
degree,
meu.
understand, because it's taken a physical form. And you know, the part that really brings me a lot of solace is that these happenings in anime are all relational. We all contribute to mementos. We all have anxieties that lend themselves to a common foe. Our relationships with others are often what brings out the mental or very physical strength to carry
Drones da
out.
pizza.
The body swap in Bunny Girl Senpai happened because of a connection between sisters. All of Shinji's struggles and Ava
Podes mandar- pois
manifested
podes,
because
meu.
of his struggles
Ei, não é
to get
cringe.
close to others.
É pretty cool.
Darius's blindness stemmed from a desperate need to please the father that he loved and admired so
Eu vi que
deeply.
podes
It's all
mandar Kamehamehas com
relational.
o...
We're all connected in one way or another, for
Com-
better or for
com-
worse.
com o Rick
Through
and
the
Morty,
good
o caralho.
and the bad, we're not alone. We're all in this together, and the feeling that I share both my anxieties
Bro,
and my
finalmente
hopes
temos
and
o
dreams
Ultimate
with
Game,
the rest
meu.
of the world is a
Diz-me uma
sensation
coisa,
that I
qual é o
think
jogo,
only
qual é o jogo
anime
que...
has
com
ever
a...
been
como é que eu ia
given.
dizer? Ah, filho da puta, este gajo é tão mau a fazer vídeos. Câncaro. Jesus Christ. O que é que eu te ia dizer? Ia dizer. O que é que eu ia dizer? Crossover. Ok, qual é o jogo com crossover, com o crossover mais ambicioso que queres jogar? Smash ou Fortnite? Ora diz-me lá. Já sabemos o que é que vais dizer, não é? Oh, fuck this fucking fucker, motherfucker. Oh my god, tem coisas mesmo fixes para ver, mas não posso ver aqui. Chrono Trigger Call Me Nature Music Mix. 6 horas. Eu queria ver, vou ser honesto, eu queria ver coisas sobre coisas, mas esta música... Hunt Showdown não é um crossover sequer, portanto... Já, não é? Claramente não ouviste a pergunta. Não pode ser. Não pode ser. Tens que ouvir as perguntas antes de responder. Ora bem. Onde é que está o filho da puta do tungstênio? Já nem sei o que é que estava à procura. Eu espero que não aconteça, mas já viste o que era tu arranjares finalmente o jogo e tipo passado, sei lá, um dia estás tipo não vale nada a mim e cagares no jogo. Olha um bichinho. Tens o jogo. Se não consegues jogar, quer dizer que não pudeste ter essa experiência que eu estou a descrever, que é jogar durante um dia e ficar tipo, you know what? Afinal, I hate this. Que seria bué da funny. Runaway Mole? Es bueno. Estoy fodido, como dizem os japoneses. Voy a comer la mierda. Sabes o que é que precisamos, mano? Jogar um Tekkenzão, mano. Isso é que é. Tecanzão. Tecanzão. Com as novas táticas. As novas táticas. Mas estou a ter pirito. Estou a piritar ou não? Este silver é para ir para o Starship, ó burro. Foi da burro. Para onde é que está a ir o pirito? Piritinho, piritolas. Alguém me sabe contar o pirito? Onde é que está? Pirito, pirito. Pirito é amarelo. Está aqui, 380. Pirito, pirito. Olha a Corai! Que saudades da Corai. Gosto da Corai. Agora já passou outra música. Já não vou a tempo. Ora, como é que está a donzela? Não digo isto de maneira pejorativa. Oi? Am I piritating? What do you mean? Estou com outlag. A culpa é minha, acho eu. Eu nasci-me. Estraguei a stream. Eu acho que voltei a pôr o delay como estava. Querem que eu dê restart? Espera. Estou a pensar qual é que seria. O que é que eu poderia fazer? Mas eu acho que... Oh meu Deus. Não, não caias. Tempo para sobriar-me. Eu não tenho certeza, mas eu acho que... Espera, eu não quero runaway mode para nada. Que eu saiba, não é? Yeah. Quer dizer, no máximo, acho que as pessoas podem ligar... Eu lembro de haver a opção no chat. Ligar o low... coisa, não é? Mas eu acho que estou com o low coisa ligado no... Deixa eu ver aqui. Puta da música alta para caralho, foda-se. Desculpem, disse as neiras. Preciso de arranjar um swear jar. Deixa eu ver. Twitch.tv. Twitch.tv. Swear jar. Definições. Proteção contra desconexão. Desligado. Modo latência. Baixa latência. Se tivesse o meu swear jar, o que é que acontecia? Está com baixa latência. Mas olhem, eu volto já, na mesma. Só vou ver aqui umas coisas nas opções e já volto.